What's happening, folks? Geologist Philip Prince talking today about the geology of fish, specifically this one, the Bartram's bass. Really interesting fish here in the southeastern U.S. Lives in only one river system. And going to be talking about the geologic event that put it in that one river system. Yes, I drew this in Microsoft Paint, especially for this video. Tried to pay close attention to the eye there. The Bartram's is a form of red-eye bass. They have a diagnostic red or brick red eye, among other distinguishing characteristics. And this was pretty cool because if you float your favorite lure in front of him, you might pick it up there and hold it for a while before he figures out what's going on. People do fish for Bartram's bass. I myself have for years, but the big interest with them is conservation because they have such a limited range. Now, the geologic event that put the Bartram's bass in its one single river home actually has consequences that go beyond fish. You see its results anytime you look at a map of the United States where you can see the state boundaries. So this is a really interesting story and a really interesting way to look at some connections between geology and other aspects of life that do not outwardly seem very geologic. But to start off, you got to see where the Bartram's bass lives. It lives in the upper Savannah River, the border between Georgia and South Carolina, upstream of Augusta. That's where the fall line is, upstream of Augusta. Rivers are going to be rockier, have gravel in their bed, and that nice pattern that the Bartram bass has with the stripes and spots is going to blend in very nicely with those rocky stream beds. Now, as far as habitat goes for the Bartram, this is it. This is the only place beyond the upper Savannah River they are not native anywhere else in the southeast. There are bass like them elsewhere, but the Bartram specifically is a savanna-only fish. And the savanna itself is a very interesting and unique river system in the southeast. And to start to understand that, you got to put it in the context of other river systems. So that's the Savannah. Its headwaters up here are called the Chattooga. You may hear me use those names sort of interchangeably in this video. And the Chattooga flows to the southwest before turning sharply to the southeast, where it becomes called the Savannah and making its way down to the Atlantic. And if you move to the northeast, add the Broad River, the Inaree River, which is about a mile behind me right now, the Saluda River, the Catawba Wateree River system, and the Yadkin PD River system. All of these rivers have these direct southeastern courses to the Atlantic Ocean. Now, if you go west of the Savannah, got the Chattahoochee to Apalachicola system that drains down to the Gulf of Mexico. And if you look at the Chattahoochee headwaters, they're actually very, very close geographically to that big bend there in the upper Savannah. We'll add the Flint River there, the Coosa River system, tributary of the Etowah River, the Black Warrior River. And once you put those together, you see that there's a suite of rivers that drain to the Gulf of Mexico along pretty direct southwest or south-directed courses. Now, to round the diagram out here, we got to throw the Tennessee in there, starting with the Little Tennessee in western North Carolina. It has a bizarre course, flows down into Alabama, turns north, goes up to Paducah, Kentucky, where it meets the Ohio River and ultimately becomes part of the Mississippi River system on its way to the Gulf of Mexico. So when you look at this map at this point, there are very distinct suites of rivers here in the southeastern U.S., and it goes beyond what's shown here. If you add the French Broad River to it, the Tennessee looks even stranger. But from what we've got here, there's trends to be seen. And each of these river systems does tend to have sort of a distinct suite of fish living in it. And as far as red-eye bass are concerned, they're going to be in Mobile Bay drainages or in the upper Chattahoochee. They're in those rivers that take the pretty direct courses down to the Gulf of Mexico. We can use the Bartram picture for them because they're very, very similar to Bartram's bass. If you show where the Bartrams live, it's pretty interesting because the Savannah River, of course, drains to the Atlantic Ocean. There's not a connection between these river systems, but they get really close to each other right there where the Chattooga takes that bend and turns into the Savannah on its way down to the Atlantic. The story gets even more interesting when you go to the Northeast. Those Atlantic rivers do not have red-eye bass in them. They may have been introduced, but they're not native there. And they're not native in the Tennessee either. That's actually smallmouth territory up there. So just looking at river systems and where these fish live, you've got red eyes in the Gulf drainages, another red eye here in an Atlantic drainage that's awfully close to the Gulf drainages, but not connected to them. And this demands an explanation, right? Why is that one river, the Savannah River system, holding red eye bass when it does not have any connection to the Gulf of Mexico. And to start to try to understand this, you just have to get closer and closer to the topography and look at more and more details of how things are laid out here, right? So we're looking at this area where Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina come together. Got the Chattooga up here turning into the Savannah after that southeast turn. That is the river that defines that Georgia-South Carolina boundary. It's very noticeable here in Georgia. That's actually what makes that little beak there in northeastern Georgia that to me is one of the state's kind of defining characteristics when you look at its outline. And if you take those state boundaries away and add the Chattahoochee, things start to look even more interesting here. The Chattooga comes down, makes that hard right turn, but it almost looks like, I don't know, like it might want to continue there into the Chattahoochee. It looks like those rivers are going to come together before they suddenly turn away from one another, right? This is even more interesting, of course, because the Chattooga Savannah system has fish in it that look almost certainly like they came out of this Gulf draining Chattahoochee River system where the other red eye populations live. Now, this is particularly interesting in this part of the Southeast because we don't have natural lakes here. This area was not glaciated. There has never been standing water in this landscape that would have connected these river systems. Generally speaking, they're also pretty different in their elevation. And you need to tighten the map up a little bit more and look at this area where it looks like they're trying to meet before they go in separate directions to see what this looks like. Now, this is centered around Hollywood, Georgia. Hollywood, Georgia doesn't get a lot of hype. There's another Hollywood in the US, of course, that gets all the attention. But Hollywood, Georgia is actually sort of very central to this discussion of fish and how these rivers might have once been connected. If you've ever eaten at Subway on Highway 441 in Hollywood, you were in a very geologic place. You may not have known that at the time, but I think you will soon see that it's a pretty interesting spot here in the Southeast. If you look at the Chattahoochee there, southwestern draining river system, higher elevation landscape than you have over here in the Atlantic slope. When I say higher, 500 feet, something like that, 600 feet. So you'd be looking at about a 150 to 180 meters, something like that elevation difference. Particularly interesting is they're around Hollywood at the actual divide between these two river systems. There's not a ridge or a mountain or something like that. Typically, if you thought about what's separating two distinct river basins that are taking really different paths to get to the ocean, you might expect there to be some high topography separating those two river systems. That's very much not the case here. In fact, it's quite flat and open. Add to that, where the Chattooga makes its turn and starts to be called the Savannah, it drops through a really deep gorge that again is hundreds of feet, couple hundred meters deep, has all kinds of whitewater rapids, and it's actually world famous for whitewater. So you have a lot of very interesting topographic characteristics that are combining with the fact that this river here on the right has fish in it that almost certainly came from the one here on the left, right? And when you start to see these things coming together, to a geologist, this is going to start ringing alarm bells that relate to a certain geologic process. Now, if we were looking at this academically, we'd be using a map looking like this. The coloration that's associated with different elevation zones is very much exaggerated here, but you got the Chattahoochee headwaters flowing down here to the southwest. Here comes the Chattooga. And instead of making that turn, you could almost visualize it just continuing straight here. The slope of the land is very well suited to that. It would almost make more sense if it stayed up there and did not make this turn and descend so steeply. And again, as a geologist, if you see this topography and you see this arrangement of the fish species, you're thinking about one specific geologic process. Going to have to illustrate that one in paint for you, so we'll jump out here. Hang on just a minute. Okay, so to take all these topographic characteristics and see what they might say about river connection, I'm going to use a simple block diagram here that's going to show what happens when two river systems like the Chattahoochee and Savannah that have overall different elevations associated with them share the same drainage divide. And this simple block is really just going to capture a topographic escarpment here that's going to be separating that higher elevation landscape from the lower one. So here's our escarpment. We'll have some high topography up here in the top corner. That's going to be a nice headwaters area for our elevated river. And if we add some rivers to this, we'll have one flowing along kind of like that. And then we'll add another river that starts right at the edge of that elevated landscape, but is flowing down and to the right onto that lower elevation surface. Now, the river right here is particularly interesting because it starts on that topographic step. So it by nature has kind of a steep area in it. That steep area is going to erode much more quickly than surrounding parts of the landscape. And over time, that low elevation river with its headwaters right there on the edge of the higher topography, it's actually going to be getting longer. The reason it gets longer is that it's trying to evolve towards a slightly shallower slope. This is called headward erosion, and it's sort of a basic concept that's associated with how river systems evolve over time. And if you keep moving this model forward, it's probably going to look like that river system is getting precariously close to this big elevated river system that in this case represents the Chattahoochee. And sure enough, if you just keep pushing this forward, it's actually going to erode until it intersects that big upper river, and it's going to divert that upper river's flow down into the lower elevation river system. This process is called stream capture or stream piracy. Geologists spend a surprising amount of time studying it, and it's very well established in the scientific literature. It, in fact, has its own Wikipedia page that is worth a look. But what you've just seen here is essentially what's happened between the Savannah at lower elevation and what's now the Chattahoochee up there at a few hundred feet, 150, 200 meters higher. Once this capture event happens, all of this high elevation water has now been given a much steeper course downhill. And when that happens, it's going to produce a lot of topographic change. So we'll actually have to rewrite some of what this landscape looks like this. And this much change occurs simply because so much water with so much steep gradient is going to be very powerfully erosive in the landscape. So it's going to carve out a big, deep gorge system, and that gorge system is going to go spreading through all the little stream tributaries that are, in this case, even too small to draw, but it's going to produce a really crazy, rough, rugged landscape. And that ruggedness will continue to sort of carve up that elevated area and turn it into something that eventually will look much more like the lower elevation landscape. Now, once we get our river drawn back in here, you may notice that it has a very distinct bend in it, like we've been talking about for the Chattooga and Savannah system. And in fact, you can go a step farther here, draw a state line along that river, and end up seeing that familiar shape of Georgia and South Carolina and what would be North Carolina with today's Chattooga headwaters in it. Now, if you take the state boundaries away, of course, it's just that drainage exchange that's the big part, and whatever fish were living in the headwaters of that elevated river, they are now living in that river that captured it. And that is why there's Bartram bass, which should be living in the Gulf of Mexico river systems, in the Savannah system that drains out to the Atlantic Ocean. The Savannah literally eroded into and captured water from those Gulf drainages and took those fish along with it, right? So fascinating story, one that has played out all around the world throughout geologic history, throughout the eastern US even. Stream capture and fish distribution is a big field of study, but there are few better examples than the one you see here with the Savannah and the Chattahoochee and the Bartram. So if you took the diagram that we just drew and turned it into an animation here in PowerPoint, you'd have the low elevation Savannah eating its way there into the Chattahoochee River system, capturing it, diverting its water, and in the process, stealing its fish population, or you might say adding its fish population to the one that's already in the savanna. The rivers are going to carve their gorges even deeper. You're going to have the Chattooga there. That's actually what's going to form Tallulah Gorge, which is another very interesting landform nearby. It's going to move the fish, and it's going to give you that distinct state boundary. And again, it all comes back to that one single capture event. Why do you call this an event? At some point, that that river connection had to be made, and it's very distinct compared to, say, like a mountain building event that might last for tens of millions of years or longer. This would have been, when it happened, presumably pretty quick. No one knows exactly what a capture event like this looks like. There's tons of them in the Appalachians, numerous examples to say the least. But suffice it to say, it's much faster than other geologic events. People research those a lot, including myself. This was actually the subject of my PhD research up at Virginia Tech years ago. And in particular, when you're trying to explore an event like this, you can actually go out onto the landscape where the captured river used to flow, and you can often find rounded river gravel just sitting out in pastures and things like that. There's no river nearby, and it's obvious there has not been one nearby for quite some time, but the traces of it are still there. So if you looked at this on the topographic map, you can imagine the savanna eating its way into the Chattahoochee system, capturing those headwaters, and that's what moves the fish there and shapes that state boundary, right? So every time you look at a map now, hopefully, instead of just seeing Georgia and South Carolina, you're going to see this stream capture event and think about the Bartram's bass as a red-eye bass that started its existence, if you will, over there in the Gulf drainages before being pulled over here into the Atlantic basin. Now, again, when did this happen? No one knows. It's old. It's presumably been so long that the Bartrams has started taking on characteristics that make it a little bit distinct from the other red eyes. Research would indicate that this is less than 11 million years old. More on that here in just a moment, but that's about the only age constraint. Certainly, it must be many hundreds of thousands of years old. I would have told you years ago, quote, a few million. Again, no one knows that for sure, but it's very recent in terms of the evolution of the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, it has nothing to do with the actual growth of the mountains. It's much more not quite a modern aspect of geology and topography here, but it's much more like one. Now, thinking about what else might have been going on in this area, the Chattahoochee River is actually kind of high compared to its neighboring river systems. That allowed it to be captured by the savanna to set up this whole story that we're telling here. But you can see it has these lighter colored areas, and it's higher than other river systems to the southeast and over here into the Coosa River to the northwest. So it's almost like maybe the Chattahoochee ultimately was sort of the father river system to all of this, and some of the other basins captured from that. Again, no one knows that for sure, but that's the way that geologists might be thinking about this. And when you step back again and look at the whole big picture, you can start to ask a few more interesting questions. And folks in South and Central Georgia, Macon area, if you thought I'd forgotten you there at the beginning, I have not. What just popped up there is the Okmulgee Altamaha system. And it does, in fact, have a red-eye type bass. It's called the Altamaha bass. Now, this is a interesting river because it does flow to the Atlantic, but it does make a sharp turn to get there. And it also has a headwaters that looks like it might be poised to eat its way there into the Chattahoochee. And it's very possible that it has done something like that to Chattahoochee tributaries in the past. The Chattahoochee River is very, very narrow. Guess we need to do it like that. I think it reflects the screen here. Because it's so narrow, it suggests that it has probably lost even more drainage basin to rivers on either side of it, kind of like you see up there with the Savannah example. It's also been suggested that the Altamaha used to continue into the Alapaha River and would have gone down into the Gulf, sort of generally along the modern Suwannee River course. That's also a hypothesis or theory, but one way or another, the Altamaha there, is probably a river system that has had drainage exchange with its neighbors, and that may do a good job of explaining why it too has a red-eye bass while flowing into the Atlantic Ocean, right? In terms of what people do with this research, it's interesting. There's conservation behind it, but believe it or not, fish and river systems are actually of great interest at very high levels in geology because of possible issues like this. If you look at the Tennessee River up here, it makes that turn. What if it did not make that turn and just went straight? It would go down towards what's today Mobile Bay, and it would have brought huge, massive amounts of sediment with it for very long periods of geologic time. People are very interested in that in the Gulf of Mexico because accumulations of sediment in the Gulf of Mexico are what produce oil and gas. And there's a lot of very fascinating research that ultimately did come out of oil and gas exploration that talks about how this continental margin here has evolved and where big sources of sediment were. And if you look here in this image, you got the Tennessee River. We're looking at 5 million years ago, and this still suggests that the Tennessee was flowing directly to the Gulf at that period of time. And you can be well assured that folks that are trying to figure out when large amounts of sediment were being deposited and where are very interested in any indication of what the rivers that delivered that sediment were actually doing. Looking at fish genetics is a very good way to figure that out, and you see this time and again in the geologic literature. So, in addition to just being a cool story about how geology can affect all sorts of things, research into fish and how these rivers might change their courses is actually very, very sought after. And this is something that I have not worked directly with over the years, but have always at least been aware of. And if you look at the academic work I did, it's always talking about evidence in terms of fish species that supports what it looks like you may see in the actual geologic and topographic record, right? The plot thickens even more, though, when you think about climate history. If you go back many millions of years ago, sea level was much higher than it is today. A lot of these river systems that connect were actually independent at that time. And it's thought that that might have been the period of time at which all of these different bass species, not just red eyes, but smallmouth, largemouth, everything else, might have started differentiating themselves. Really interesting piece of work right here. I think you can find this paper for free online. I'll try to put a link down in the description. So, that also adds complexity to the fish story. And when sea level was this high, the Tennessee would almost certainly have been flowing straight down to it here. So the landscape that you see today in the Appalachians is not exactly like it was in pretty recent geologic history, well after the mountain range initially formed. And during all that while, within all these different river systems, all kinds of cool stuff has been happening to the fish species to create the ecological layout that you see today, right? And this isn't limited to Southern Appalachia. You find stories like this around the world. It has had a lot of effects here in the Appalachians, and a lot of the Appalachian biodiversity can probably be traced to events like this one. But it's just how the planet works, and it's something that you will find being explored again all over the world and in all sorts of settings. So hope you enjoyed this one. Might get out of the Appalachians for the next video. Not sure about that, but please tune in.